Imagine two people who earn the exact same salary. They live in the same city. They went to similar schools. They even started their careers around the same time. Fast forward 20 years. One of them has financial freedom, investments, options, time. The other is still living paycheck to paycheck. Wondering how that happened. Same income, completely different outcomes. And here's the uncomfortable truth. For most people, escaping the paycheck cycle has very little to do with how much money they make. But this creates a bigger problem. Because if income isn't the real reason people stay stuck, then what is? My name is Jimmy, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, investing, and the psychology behind how people use it. If you're someone who wants to understand money a little better, consider subscribing and giving this video a thumbs up. Now here's the thing. Most people believe the paycheck cycle works like this. You earn money, you pay your bills, you spend, what's left? And if you can just earn a little more, everything will finally get easier. But something strange starts to happen when people start making more money. Their lifestyle starts growing at the exact same speed. And almost nobody talks about this part. Let me tell you a story. Imagine a guy named Alex. Alex just graduated college and lands his first real job. Nothing crazy, just a normal salary. Maybe $50,000 a year. At first, life feels tight. Rent, groceries, student loans, gas, every expense feels noticeable. Alex checks his bank account constantly. Every purchase requires a little bit of thinking. And because money feels limited, Alex naturally spends carefully. But then something happens. 2 years later, Alex gets a promotion. His salary jumps to $65,000. Suddenly things feel easier. He upgrades his apartment. Nothing crazy, just something a little nicer. But this is where most people make a huge mistake, because lifestyle upgrades rarely happen all at once. They happen slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. A slightly nicer car, better restaurants, more subscriptions, more convenience. And here's where things get interesting. Every upgrade feels reasonable. None of them feel reckless. But together, they quietly reset what normal life costs. Fast forward another 5 years. Alex now earns $90,000 a year, which, on paper, should feel incredible compared to where he started. But the strange thing is, it doesn't, because his life now costs almost $90,000 a year. And this is where the paycheck cycle tightens its grip. Every dollar is already assigned to something. Rent, car payments, travel, subscriptions, weekend spending. Now look, Alex isn't irresponsible. He works hard, pays his bills, lives like everyone else around him. But the real issue isn't what you think. It's not about discipline. It's about psychology. Because human beings are incredibly good at adapting to better circumstances. Psychologists call this something called hedonic adaptation. It's the idea that improvements in lifestyle quickly become normal. That new car feels amazing. For about 3 weeks, that bigger apartment feels exciting until it just becomes your apartment. And then something strange happens. Your brain stops seeing these upgrades as luxuries. They become necessities. And this is where the paycheck cycle becomes dangerous, because your life slowly becomes too expensive to question. Let's go back to Alex for a moment. 10 years into his career, Alex earns $110,000, which statistically places him well above the median income, but he still feels financially stressed. Why? Because his financial structure now looks like this: a $600 car payment, $2,200 rent, student loan payments, insurance, travel, dining out, subscriptions, random spending. And by the time the month ends, almost everything is gone. But here's where things get even more interesting, because Alex isn't alone. According to a 2023 report from Lending Club, around 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Even among people earning over $100,000 per year, nearly half still report living paycheck to paycheck. Which sounds impossible at first, but when you look closer, it actually makes perfect sense. Because the paycheck cycle isn't an income problem, it's a structure problem, and almost nobody talks about this part. Let me introduce you to someone else. Her name is Maya. Maya started her career earning almost the exact same salary as Alex. Same city, same income range, same opportunities. But Maya had one small habit that changed everything, and it didn't feel important at the time. When Maya got her first job, she did something simple. Before she ever touched her paycheck, she automatically moved a small portion into investments. Nothing dramatic, maybe 10%. Now you might be thinking, saving 10% isn't life-changing. And you're right. At first, it barely feels noticeable. But something subtle starts to happen. Because Maya never sees that money as spendable. It never enters her lifestyle, which means her lifestyle quietly adjusts to the remaining 90%. And this is where things get interesting. When Maya gets a raise, she increases her investing slightly. When she earns more, she saves a little more. But her lifestyle grows slower than her income, and this tiny gap creates something powerful. Financial breathing room. At first, the gap is small, maybe a few $100s a month, but over time, the gap grows. And this is where most people completely underestimate the power of time. Let's do some very simple math. If someone invests $500 a month into a basic index fund earning around 8% annually, after 20 years, they would have roughly $295,000, not because they were brilliant investors, not because they got lucky, but because they started early and stayed consistent. But here's the part people miss. The real power isn't the money. It's the freedom the money eventually creates. Because at some point, the investments start generating income on their own. And this is where the psychology of money flips completely. When Maya is 40 years old, something strange happens. Her investments begin producing meaningful returns, dividends, growth, compounding, and suddenly, the money she invested years ago starts working harder than the money she earns at her job. But Alex is still trapped in the same structure. Every paycheck already has a destination, which means Alex is still dependent on the next paycheck. And this creates something psychologists call financial fragility. Financial fragility is when a person's life depends on uninterrupted income. Even a small disruption, a layoff, a medical bill, a recession, can suddenly create panic. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because this isn't about intelligence. Many people stuck in the paycheck cycle are incredibly smart. But something strange happens with money decisions. They're often driven by social pressure. Now look, humans are deeply social creatures. We constantly compare our lives to the people around us. Friends, coworkers, neighbors, social media. And this creates a powerful invisible force called lifestyle signaling. People unconsciously use spending to signal success. The car, the apartment, the vacations, the restaurants. And here's the thing. None of these decisions feel irrational in the moment. But this creates a bigger problem. Because signaling success and building wealth are often opposite behaviors. Here's what most people don't realize. The wealthiest people in many communities are often the least obvious. Thomas Stanley, who wrote The Millionaire Next Door, spent decades studying American millionaires, and he found something surprising. Many millionaires drove normal cars, lived in modest homes, avoided unnecessary luxury purchases, not because they couldn't afford them, but because they understood something deeper about money. Every dollar spent is a dollar that can't compound. And compounding is where real wealth quietly grows. But the real issue isn't just spending, it's something deeper. Because escaping the paycheck cycle requires one uncomfortable shift in thinking. Delayed gratification. And this is where things get interesting psychologically. Humans are naturally wired for short-term rewards. Our brains evolved to prioritize immediate survival and pleasure, not 30-year investment strategies. Which means spending today always feels more satisfying than saving for decades. But something strange starts to happen when people begin investing consistently. Time starts working for them instead of against them. Let's go back to Maya one more time. At 25, her investments feel small. At 30, they feel modest. At 35, they start feeling noticeable. But by 45, they become powerful. Because compounding doesn't grow linearly. It grows exponentially. In the early years, progress feels slow, almost invisible. And this is exactly where most people quit. They invest for a year or two. Nothing dramatic happens, so they stop. But here's the hidden truth. The most powerful years of compounding happen later. The first $100,000 invested is usually the hardest. The second $100,000 happens faster. The third, faster still. And suddenly wealth begins accelerating. But Alex never reaches this stage because his financial structure never allowed for consistent investing. And this is where most people make a huge mistake. They believe financial freedom requires massive sacrifices, extreme frugality, giving up everything fun, living like a monk. But the reality is much simpler. Escaping the paycheck cycle is less about sacrifice and more about design. Designing your financial life so that investing happens automatically. Designing your lifestyle so it grows slower than your income. Designing your spending so it reflects your values, not social pressure. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what if someone is already stuck in the paycheck cycle? That's a fair question, because many people are. Rent is expensive, inflation exists, life happens. But the turning point often begins with a single realization. Your income determines how much money enters your life, but your structure determines whether any of it stays. And small structural changes can have enormous long-term effects. Even saving an extra $200 a month consistently can transform your financial future over decades. But this requires one uncomfortable moment of honesty, looking at where money actually goes, not where we think it goes. And almost nobody enjoys doing this, because spending habits reveal priorities, sometimes surprising ones, but awareness creates control. Once someone understands their spending patterns, they can begin making intentional choices. Not perfect choices, not extreme choices, just slightly better ones. And over time, slightly better choices compound. Same way investments do. Here's the deeper truth most people eventually discover about money. Wealth rarely arrives dramatically. There's no sudden moment where everything changes overnight. Instead, wealth builds quietly, through habits, through structure, through patience. And that's why the paycheck cycle is so powerful, because it feels normal. Everyone around you seems to live the same way. Work, earn, spend, repeat. But something strange happens when someone finally breaks the cycle. They gain something far more valuable than money: time, options, freedom, the ability to say no, the ability to take risks, the ability to walk away from situations that no longer serve them. And that's why the psychology of money matters so much. Because escaping the paycheck cycle isn't about becoming obsessed with money. It's about designing a life where money stops controlling your decisions. And maybe the most important realization is this: the paycheck cycle isn't broken with one dramatic financial decision. It's broken with hundreds of small ones, quiet decisions, invisible decisions, decisions that most people around you may never even notice. But over time, those decisions change everything, because the real secret behind financial freedom isn't earning more. It's keeping enough of what you earn, long enough for time to do the heavy lifting. And the people who eventually escape the paycheck cycle rarely look extraordinary while they're doing it. Their lives often look normal, maybe even boring, but something powerful is happening beneath the surface. Money is quietly working for them, compounding, growing, expanding their future choices. And one day, without much drama, they realize something. The next paycheck is no longer something they depend on. It's just something they receive. And here's the strange part about that moment. It rarely feels dramatic. There's no celebration, no fireworks, no sudden realization that life has completely changed. Instead, it feels almost ordinary. One day you check your investments, and you notice something subtle. The growth from your investments that year might be equal to several months of your salary. Not because you worked harder, not because you got another promotion, but because time has been quietly doing its job. And this is where the psychology of money shifts again. Because once people experience this, their relationship with money changes forever. They stop asking questions like, how much can I afford to spend this month? And they start asking different questions. How much can I invest this year? How long can I let this compound? How much freedom can this buy me later? But the real insight here is something most people discover too late. Escaping the paycheck cycle isn't about reaching some magical income level. There's no number where everything suddenly becomes easy. There are people earning $40,000 who are building wealth, and there are people earning $200,000 who feel financially trapped. Because the paycheck cycle isn't about income, it's about dependency. If your lifestyle requires every paycheck to survive, the cycle continues. But when your investments slowly begin covering pieces of your life, the cycle starts loosening. First, they cover a few small expenses, maybe groceries, maybe utilities. Later, maybe your rent. And eventually, if given enough time, they can cover your entire lifestyle. But something interesting happens along the way, because once people experience even a small amount of financial breathing room, their behavior changes. They become less stressed about money. They make calmer decisions. They take smarter risks. And this creates a powerful feedback loop. Less financial stress leads to better financial decisions. Better financial decisions lead to more financial stability. And over decades, that stability compounds, just like investments do. But the most important part of this entire story is something incredibly simple. The paycheck cycle doesn't trap people because they're careless. It traps them because the system feels normal. Everyone around them lives the same way. Everyone upgrades their lifestyle with every raise. Everyone assumes they'll figure it out later. But time moves quietly. Years pass quickly. And the people who eventually escape the cycle usually started long before it felt urgent. They didn't wait for the perfect moment. They didn't wait until they earned more. They simply started designing their financial lives differently. A little less spending, a little more investing, a little more patience. And over decades, that difference becomes enormous. Because in the end, wealth isn't built through dramatic financial moves. It's built through quiet consistency. Small habits repeated thousands of times. Decisions that feel almost insignificant in the moment. But decisions that, given enough time, reshape an entire life. And once someone steps outside of that cycle, something else begins to change. Not just their finances, their entire perspective. Because when your survival no longer depends on the next paycheck, the world starts to look different. Work feels different. Risk feels different. Even time itself feels different. Most people spend their lives in what you could call financial urgency. Every decision is connected to the next bill, the next payment, the next paycheck. And when your mind is constantly solving short-term financial problems, it becomes incredibly difficult to think long-term. This is something behavioral economists talk about often. Scarcity changes how people think. When resources feel tight, the brain focuses on immediate needs, not future planning, not investing, not compounding wealth, just survival. And this is one of the hidden reasons the paycheck cycle is so difficult to escape. Because the cycle doesn't just affect your bank account, it affects your mental bandwidth. When money feels tight, every unexpected expense feels like a crisis. A car repair, a medical bill, a broken appliance. Each one creates stress. Each one demands immediate attention. And when people are constantly reacting to financial problems, they rarely have the energy to build financial systems. But this is where things start to shift once someone begins building even a small financial buffer. Because a buffer changes the emotional experience of money. Instead of panic, there's patience. Instead of urgency, there's optionality. And optionality might be one of the most underrated financial advantages a person can have. Optionality means having choices. The ability to say no to a job that drains you. The ability to take time to learn new skills. The ability to wait for the right opportunity instead of accepting the first one out of fear. But here's what most people don't realize. Optionality is built long before it's needed. It's built quietly through years of saving, investing, and restraint. Years where nothing dramatic seems to happen. Years where progress feels slow. Years where the payoff is invisible. And this is where patience becomes such a powerful financial advantage. Because most people underestimate what small decisions can become over long periods of time. A few $100s invested every month may feel insignificant today. But over 20 or 30 years, those small investments can grow into something life-changing. Not through luck, not through timing the market, but through consistency. And consistency is surprisingly rare. Not because people don't want financial freedom, but because the results take time. And modern life trains us to expect everything quickly. Instant entertainment, instant purchases, instant gratification. But wealth doesn't follow those rules. Wealth grows slowly, quietly, almost invisibly at first. And that's why the people who build it often look completely ordinary while they're doing it. They don't look like financial geniuses. They don't make dramatic moves. They simply repeat small, disciplined decisions over long periods of time. Investing when it's boring, saving when it feels unnecessary, avoiding lifestyle inflation when everyone else is upgrading. And eventually, those quiet decisions start producing loud results. Because at some point, the math of compounding becomes undeniable. Money begins generating more money than effort alone ever could. And once that happens, the entire relationship with work begins to change. Work becomes something you choose, not something you depend on. Opportunities become easier to pursue. Risks become easier to take. And the future becomes far more flexible than it once seemed. But the most powerful part of escaping the paycheck cycle isn't the money itself. It's the shift in control. Instead of life pushing you from one paycheck to the next, you begin shaping your life around your own priorities. And that's the quiet promise behind long-term investing and financial discipline. Not luxury, not status, not flashy displays of wealth, but freedom. The freedom to decide how your time is spent. The freedom to pursue work that feels meaningful. The freedom to live without constant financial pressure. And for many people, that freedom begins with a surprisingly small decision. The decision to stop living exactly the way everyone else does. To stop upgrading every part of life the moment income increases. To stop assuming that financial stress is just a permanent part of adulthood. Because once someone sees the paycheck cycle clearly, they realize something important. It isn't a rule, it's a pattern. And patterns can be changed. One decision at a time,